Today we will be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of South Carolina. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All of the filing data comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. Now, this first chart shows total filings by year since 1990 in the state. And during that time, there have been more than 250,000 cases filed statewide. In the early 1990s, filings were running 6,000 to 7,000 per year. By the late 1990s, around 12,000 was the norm. There are further increases in the early 2000s and getting up to 16,000 cases in 2003. A little drop off in 2004 and 2005, and this is very unusual because virtually every state had their peak year of filings in 2005, which is the year of bankruptcy reform. But South Carolina really didn't have the surge in filings that every other state showed. But they certainly did have the drop off in 2006. Filings dropped by more than half. Increased somewhat during the recession up to nearly 10,000 again by 2009, and then have dropped over the last 6 years by about 30%. So right now filings at around 7,000 are right where they were back in the early 1990s in the state. But one thing that really stands out in this chart is there is not as much variation in the South Carolina numbers as there were in most other states. Now looking at filings relative to population, and on this chart, red are the states that have the highest bankruptcy rates, and yellow have the lowest. Most of the states with the lowest tend to be in the Northeast, but South Carolina also has a very low rate, actually fourth lowest in the country at 44% below average over the years, and just behind Alaska, Hawaii, and Vermont are the three that have a lower bankruptcy rate than South Carolina. Year by year, there isn't too much of a trend in that basically South Carolina is quite low relative to the national average every year. This chart shows Chapter 7 filings by year, and it's pretty much the same basic pattern with under 4,000 filings in the early 1990s up to about 6,000 in the late 1990s. Around 7,000 in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. A little spike in 2005, but not nearly as much as every other state had, dropping by around 3/4 in 2006. Big surge up through 2009, 2010 with the Great Recession, and then dropping back down to under 3,000 cases per year in 2015. So right now, Chapter 7 filings in the state are about where they were in 1990. Chapter 11s in the state show a big drop off throughout the 1990s, and this was typical of virtually every state. Since, say, about 1998, there have been generally about 50 to 60 Chapter 11s filed per year, a little bit higher during recessions, particularly during the Great Recession, but and very low in 2015 and also 2016. It only looks like maybe 35 or 40 will be filed this year. So right now the Chapter 11 rate in South Carolina is as low as it's ever been, and just a fraction of where it was, say, 25 years ago. Chapter 13s in South Carolina show fairly steady in the early 1990s. Then we had 10 straight annual increases where filings about tripled. So we got up to 9,000 per year in 2003. Some drop-offs up till 2005, a big drop in 2006, which most states had. Very modest increase. It's actually been fairly flat since 2006 in the 4,000 to 5,000 range. And this is well below where it was prior to bankruptcy reform, but above where it was back in the 1990s, where in most states the Chapter 13s are about the same as where they were in 1990. Now, looking at the percent of cases filed is Chapter 13's, the national average year by year has been running right around 30%, with some disruption before and after bankruptcy reform. In South Carolina, it's been a little over 40% and has come up to about 60% over the years, so just slight increases over time. So to the point where South Carolina now has one of the highest Chapter 13 proportions in the country, even though the overall bankruptcy rate is very low in South Carolina. Looking at the unemployment rate by quarter in South Carolina is kind of a proxy for how the economy is going. You can see that most quarters, South Carolina has been 1 or 2% above the national average, and particularly during the recession, there's kind of a gap between the unemployment rate in South Carolina and the national average, showing that it was the state was affected, for a long period and fairly severely. But the rate has come down and is pretty close to the average right now, still a little over 5% in the state. Now, bankruptcy filings peaked nationwide in September 2010, most recently. That's the most recent peak since bankruptcy reform. Nationwide, since 2010, filings are down 49%. The biggest declines have been in most of New England and in the Southwest, where the declines have been in the 60-70% range. And in most of the Southeast, the rate of decline has been much lower. And South Carolina, particularly, a 29% decrease since September 2010. That's fifth lowest in the country after Puerto Rico, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama have slightly lower things. But throughout the Southeast, the declines have generally been less. Looking quarter by quarter, in 2011, the declines in South Carolina were the heaviest and tend to be a little bit more than average. Most other years since then, they have had smaller than average declines, and even a few quarters where filings have increased. Right now, we have kind of an unclear pattern of where filings are going next. But certainly nationwide and in most states, the rate of decline is slowing down. In the first half of this year, the decline in South Carolina is right at the national average at about 6%. Third quarter filings were down only 1%. And so as far as the outlook goes, I think that there will be about 6,700 cases filed in the state this year. In the next couple of coming years, filings should be in the 7,000 to 10,000 range. And I don't see any return to the 10,000 or more cases that were filed in South Carolina, say from 1997 to 2005, unless another recession hits or some major change to the bankruptcy laws. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in the state of South Carolina. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.